Welcome to Digital Transformation Bite Size. This is a show dedicated to introducing you to high and emerging technology companies and thought leaders in the industry. Today, we have Antti, the CEO of Robocorp, and we have Peter, Head of Content Marketing Partnerships. Robocorp are leading open source RPA software. To date, they've raised over $12 million in venture capital money. Welcome, chaps. Thank you so much for coming along today.
Thank you for having us.
So if I can ask you a couple of questions, let's see where we get to. So Antti, what encouraged you, or Antti, what motivated you to start Robocorp?
So my background is in software engineering. I basically just realized that there's this massive industry starting up in RPA roughly 4 years since, and just found it really strange that there's no open source alternatives. Somebody working inside software is kind of natural to build on top of kind of open source foundations. So seeing this huge industry coming up and basically being all about closed and proprietary ecosystems, I thought that it would be something worthwhile pursuing. So that's how it started.
So why should anyone else pursue open source software when they're considering implementing RPA?
So to us, RPA is in fact kind of closer to building software than something that would be in a sense no code. So our take on the industry is that when you're building RPA, you should be building with kind of the best practices already available in software development. Obviously, we want to make it easy and frictionless to do. So we build tools for RPA developers that are kind of easy to use and easy to get started with. But so if you take the view that RPA is software as anything else is, then building on top of an open source ecosystem is kind of a natural step after that realization. So kind of, why would somebody care about open source and RPA? Fundamentally, it's about the capabilities to you're bringing and kind of being able to build on top of an open source foundation instead of being dependent on a proprietary ecosystem alone.
Interesting. How old is Robocorp?
So we established the company officially in 2019, early in the year, but we've been working on this already since 2018. And some of the open source projects that we are leveraging have been around for more than a decade.
What's been the most satisfying part of running Robocorp to date?
So many kind of new things with just running a startup company in general. But I'd say that genuinely the most satisfying part is when you see somebody in the community, creating a video or blog post or something similar about the products that we've been building so hard over the years, and just seeing that kind of community adoption of the technology. That's really the best part of it.
It's nice when our children grow up, I think, and people start to get to know them. Hopefully the children you want to get to know as well. But Peter, if you don't mind, can I bring you in for a second? There's a lot of common misconceptions around open source RPA, but what are the most common misconceptions around open source and open source RPA?
I would say probably the most common one is that it isn't as robust or doesn't have as much power as a more traditional RPA offering. I think that when you look at the what we can access in terms of the library, hundreds of libraries, thousands of keywords, we're capable of producing end-to-end complex intelligent automations just like the more traditional RPA providers would be. And it would even be our point that we can do that in a way that would be more flexible to ensure the success of those automation projects. So Robocorp is built off a community called Robot Framework, which is also Python extensible. So we like to joke here, but also say very seriously that our only limit is the world of Python. So that's probably the most common misconception, but also one of the most common strengths, or one of the strongest points of Robocorp.
I think the largest community of developers in the world. But are there some downsides to open source software and open source RPA?
Well, certainly. I mean, this is where you would enter into the conversation of build versus buy, right? So we're certainly, there is a element of you needing to understand or have basic Python scripting knowledge or basic programming skills. We try to set the bar for that pretty low here. As Antti mentioned, we have some great tools. We also have great documentation to help people expand their careers. But I would say that that's the primary downside to an open source methodology, is that you're staring at a screen of code rather than as a drag and drop tooling, which can be intimidating to some people. But we're trying to make that level of intimidation relatively low and encourage people to understand, what that opens up for their world of building RPA projects.
And are many companies and people adopting open source RPA?
Absolutely. I think Antti would love to take that one.
Yeah, love to take that, because I'm exposed to these conversations every day. I know that Peter is also doing those conversations around our partnerships, but right now we actually see good traction in the enterprise side of things, and maybe some of the misconceptions that Peter referred to would be also that something like an enterprise company can't use open source, but on the contrary, that's often we see the case that larger companies don't want to be locked into a single vendor when doing something as business critical as RPA. So they want to have that flexibility and the ownership of their bots in a way that only open source can allow them. So we see adoption across individual developers, partners who are doing implementation for us, kind of mid-market segment, and then also starting now top of the market as well.
Interesting. Are there particular types of companies best suited to open source RPA?
I'd say that anyone who already is doing RPA should look into it kind of seriously. So anyone who has the good understanding and base knowledge of these are the processes that we want to automate, this is how we work with RPA, they should seriously consider including something like Robocorp in the stack of tools that they have. Somebody starting out novice in RPA can just as well adopt it, but kind of we don't specifically promote a citizen developer-led approach. So we want to set the bar just a bit higher than the typical RPA tool would do in terms of development. But that by doing that, it allows us to kind of set the ceiling really high in terms of what you can achieve in power and complexity of processes and just the extendability of the tool itself.
Does it limit the number of software developers who might use your product when you set a higher bar, or because you've set a higher bar?
Yeah, so the way we look at RPA in general, when you look at the space kind of long enough, you actually realize that you have dedicated RPA developers who are building those parts. Majority of the cases, we don't typically see extended use cases around citizen developers, to be honest. So when we start with something that's more familiar to an RPA developer, we don't see that that would necessarily limit the number of users. Certainly, we don't set the expectation in a way that anyone coming cold to the field of automation should be able to use it. That's kind of where we start. But I'd say that majority of the RPA practitioners out there are going to feel themselves kind of at home with the tools that we have.
Interesting. One thing can be quite difficult for companies is to organize their teams. How do you organize an open source community to work together to deliver a fantastic product?
Well, the open source community itself, it consists of individuals who kind of either through their profession or through their hobby work with a certain project. And with something as horizontal as RPA, it is really a collection of multiple projects or hundreds and hundreds of projects that we are leveraging here. In fact, any modern software development work is going to involve hundreds of open source projects under the hood anyway. So what we do is we at some projects we think strategically. So we might invest heavily in the development of the core robot framework itself. somewhere where there's not a suitable project, we create it ourselves. So RPA framework being one, the kind of the core library set for automation. That's something that we built. And then we have a lot of we've done a lot of work around the tooling that you need to bring it all together. So it's about picking the projects where you're going to be strategic about knowing the right communities, understanding how those communities work, and to us it's something that's pretty natural.
How do open source companies stay in business? Open source isn't free.
It certainly isn't free to develop open source. Some of the open source projects out there, like Linux kernel, you can look at their contributor list, and it's mostly people from large corporations who are putting in that work, sponsored by them and paid by them. So open source has a number of business models that we've seen over the years. So kind of the traditional model would be support services led model, kind of the Red Hat in a way. That's something that we don't see anymore that much. What we actually see is an open core model. So something like MongoDB might be open source software, but they do have a hosted version of the service. So similarly, we are hosting an orchestration service for bots that are built with the open source RPA stack. And so that's really the commercial offering that we have as a company, and that's something that's really business critical. Oftentimes is kind of more expensive to run and maintain, and so it just makes sense to have that as a hosted service that you can purchase, and then build those bots with an open source stack.
What does the future hold for open source companies, do you think?
Well, I mean, open source software is really to me, it's really the only way to build software nowadays, not even in the future, but just right now. And more enterprise software is gonna build with open source foundations. That's something that we see across the board. Just like commercial open source software is really something that's gonna be the sort of the majority of software that's being built in the future, and an open core model is really a good way to monetize the software. So I'd say that we're gonna see a ton more of that in the future.
What do you see as the future for Robocorp?
So as a company, obviously, we want to make sure that the stack that we are building with Robo Framework and Python-based RPA, that stack becomes the industry norm in a way, that any IT automation stack in the future is going to have a software robot in there. So it's going to become something that's basically used by any company of any reasonable size in the IT operations as a part of the toolbox. So I'd say that we want to make sure that RPA gets in a way normalized. It's used across the board to solve different kind of problems and needs inside enterprises, and we want to be the layer that creates that sort of standardization. When you have an open source alternative that has a robust community, robust tooling, that you can just start using immediately, why would you want to go through a longer route where you need to figure out POCs and evaluations and calling up vendors? That's really the future that we want to build, and have Robocorp really drive the future of RPA.
I kind of love the sound of open source as a future. A lot of people will point to the so-called big 3, big 10 and say, well, I've got my software escrow agreement in place, but who's really going to build it if one of the big companies goes out of business? Whereas in the open source community, we have a bit of a chance, I think. Chaps, look, thank you so much. Just for the audience sake then, if people want to find out a little bit more about Robocorp and open source software, Peter, what would you recommend they do?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So going back to also how we're developing our community. So of course we have robocorp.com, and as Antti mentioned, you can almost instantaneously set up your Robocorp tools and start building with us immediately. And then as well as find us on Slack. There's emails on the website. We have very robust documentation in order to help people get up and running, but we'd love to hear from anybody and everybody. We're also very excited about being able to democratize RPA efforts as well, too. Being it's so easy and free to get started, we're really enthusiastic about seeing people around the globe from all shapes and sizes using Robocorp.
Fantastic. Something I'm looking forward to myself. The more people who use it, the better the market is, the more success stories I hope to read about and maybe talk about. Peter, Antti, absolutely delighted to meet you, both of you today. I wish you every success with Robocorp. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk. Every success in the future, and we'll no doubt meet again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.